when it comes to the process of assisting people to become the persons that God's calling to be, there's two things we're kind of called to do, right? And so the first thing we might call exhortation, this idea of pointing out people's blind spots, areas of growth that they might not otherwise be aware of, right? And so think about the parable of the workers in the vineyard or the parable of the unforgiving servants. But also we're called to go the way of encouragement, going the way of affirmation, the way of unconditional positive regard. And one of the most notable examples that you find in the gospel to illustrate this particular point is found in the gospel of Matthew chapter 21, the parable of the two sons. So basically there's this landowner who goes to his sons one at a time to invite them to work in his vineyard. The first guy says no, but then eventually comes, and the second guy says yes, but then eventually refuses. And then the question is obviously posed, which of these two sons actually did the will of his father? And the answer, of course, is the first guy. Again, the guy who initially said no, but then eventually came to actually work in the vineyard. Now, before we get to the gist of the story, I want to point out a couple of ways that this parable tends to be kind of misinterpreted. And so one common way to misinterpret this particular parable is to reduce it to something really superficial, like actions speak louder than words. But you got to remember that the parables of Jesus Christ, they're not like fables, right? So they can never be reduced to a single line and certainly not a single word. So there's a certain complexity when it comes to the parables that we always need to appreciate. Now that said, another really common misunderstanding when it comes to this particular parable is to see it as an invitation to openly rebel against the Lord. And so from this perspective, the whole idea is that the parable of the two sons is openly inviting us to question God's goodness or to openly rebel against his commandments. But you got to appreciate that the gospel in general will never actually invite us to openly rebel against the will of our Father in heaven. So obviously that particular rendering or interpretation of the text is not really valid. So obviously it kind of begs the question, what's really the point when it comes to the parable of the two sons? Well, as per usual when it comes to the gospel and the parables in particular, it's all about the details. So right off the bat, it's really important to note that the entire parable is an allegory, right? Where different things represent different things. And so the father in the story obviously represents God. The vineyard represents the world. The work to be done in the vineyard represents the work of salvation. And the two sons represent obviously us. And in particular, the two responses that we can possibly make when it comes to the divine invitation. But more to the point, in the context of the story, when we talk about kind of bringing about the work of salvation or cooperating with the work of salvation in the world, generally speaking, the way by which that particular salvation is brought about is through obedience to the will of the Father in heaven, as opposed to simply, doing randomly good things or doing the most difficult thing. But that said, obviously the particular way in which Jesus Christ brings about the salvation of the world is through the narrow way of the cross, right? By going the way of suffering and death. And once you understand that, you come to appreciate why the two sons respond the way that they do. And so when it comes to the first son who says no, perhaps we might say that the reason why he says no is because he gets it. And on top of that, he's being honest. And so in a certain sense, what he's saying to his father is, I looked at, even though I understand that you're inviting me to suffer and die with you for the salvation of the world, I got to be honest that I'm not really chomping at the bit to suffer and die for anything, even though it's with you and even though it's for a really good cause, again, namely the salvation of the world. Now, on the other hand, when it comes to the second son, when he says yes, actually in the original Greek, what he says is, that's me, sir. You get the sense that in contrast to the first son, he doesn't really appreciate what's being asked of him. And more to the point, perhaps the reason why he says yes so quickly in this really superficial sort of way is because he simply thinks that's what the father wants to hear. Quite apart from asking myself first, is that something that I want to do myself? Now that said, perhaps we might say that the real key to unpacking this particular passage is to be attentive to a really important translation issue. And so basically when the first son comes back, what we hear in the original Greek is that he aftercared. And so sometimes this particular phrase is translated as he thought better of it or he changed his mind. But again, the more accurate translation is that he aftercared, which conveys something really particular. And so the whole idea is that even though he may have had, again, this deep apprehension when it came to the notion of suffering and dying for anything, over time, with distance, with patience, he came to realize, perhaps to his great surprise, that truly my deepest desire is to do the will of my Father in heaven. And so, now it's my great joy to go back to my Father, to run in the direction that my Father wants me to run. Okay, so obviously there's kind of a lot going on here, but it kind of begs the obvious question, what's the takeaway message? Well, perhaps you might say that the takeaway message when it comes to this parable is to respect the process and to not skip steps, but instead to realize that necessarily we have to work through all these preliminary no's, the no of fear and apprehension and anxiety and selfishness, even the no of sin, to get to the point where eventually we make this firm, unflinching yes to Jesus Christ in a stance of love and authentic discipleship. To illustrate the point, I always think about the analogy of writing a term paper, right? And so if you think about it, back in grade school days even, we were taught this whole process of brainstorming and mind mapping. Never mind the whole idea of doing different drafts before I get to the final draft. And I don't know about you, but for the longest time, whenever I thought about this particular way of writing a paper, I used to think that was for people who had no lives, people who had time to burn, people who had no idea of efficiency and productivity. So in my mind, I thought, well, why not just skip all those steps and get to immediately the final draft? But the irony, of course, is that if you do that, if you skip all those steps, this thing which you call the final draft, in reality, it's simply the first draft. And more to the point, this thing which you call the final draft, there's no way it would be good as it could have been if you hadn't skipped all those different steps. And obviously, so it goes when it comes to the spiritual life, right? And so perhaps I might put it like this, friends. A lot of times we put undue pressure on ourselves to be strong all the time, to be perfect right away, to leave no room for ourselves to be persons in the process of becoming. And we try to rationalize this approach to life and this mentality by saying, well, look, we're trying to be efficient, we're trying to be productive, we're trying to be good people, we're trying to do the will of God. Whereas in reality, God doesn't actually want you to live in that way. But instead, even though it might sound kind of surprising, He actually invites you to be extraordinarily patient with yourself, to give yourself time and space to grow, to be imperfect, to take one step back in favor of taking 2 steps forward. That's actually the most effective and smooth way to become the person that God is calling you to be. And more to the point, that's simply a much better way to live. And may God bless you all.